Consumer trends in the MENA region are changing in line with inflation, sustainability, the metaverse, and the global economy of the future. Those are the findings of the GfK Consumer Pulse study. And GfK's Global Vice President, Dr. Christoph Preuss, joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us today. Now, how are MENA consumers really adapting to the financial pressures of inflation, and what's really affecting consumers so far in 2022?
Maybe let me start with firstly with a global outlook, and there obviously we see the impact, post-COVID impact, and geopolitical tensions around Russia and Ukraine, and that this has a massive knock-on effect on inflation and inflationary concerns. So we see that basically every second, third person globally is concerned massively around inflation. And that's also reflected in MENA. So the MENA region is no real exception and is in a much better condition, especially if we look at the MENA 3 on UAE and Saudi Arabia. But it's also affected by these global macro trends.
And taking all of this into account, how do MENA consumers really feel about their future economic situation and their future financial status?
That's a very interesting point that you're bringing up there, because we have seen that the confidence level is actually very high. So 4 out of 10 MENA 3 consumers are confident about their personal situation, and almost 60% are confident when it comes to the 12-month outlook for their respective countries. What we also see in the MENA 3 is a slight difference in markets. So we have even higher confidence levels, or the highest confidence levels, in UAE and Saudi Arabia, and less so in Egypt. And this comes back to my previous point, that we also see that the inflationary concern is highest in Egypt. And what was kind of interesting to see is that from the survey that we run in these markets with almost 2,000 consumers in these markets, that this pretty much reflects reality from what we believe is the reality from the IMF and also the World Bank, who give a kind of slightly better, or much better outlook actually in terms of GDP growth for UAE and Saudi Arabia of 5 to 7%. And slightly less so for Egypt, around 4 to 5%, but also for Egypt, the highest inflationary outlook, around 14-15%. And that's different in UAE and Saudi Arabia, where the inflationary forecast from the IMF is way lower, around 3-4% only for 2022. So there's a very solid outlook, macroeconomic outlook for UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that's also what drives the confidence levels in these markets.
So you're saying that 4 out of 10 and 6 out of 10 is high in terms of prospects for their future economic situation?
Exactly. And when I'm saying it's high, we are comparing these against the benchmarks and the studies that we've been running globally in more than 25 markets for the last 25 years, when we analyze consumer sentiment and behaviors, and confidence levels are in relatively global terms relatively high in UAE and Saudi Arabia. So this was really a very astonishing, amazing aspect that we figured in here in our study in May.
It really is. Now, let's move on to consumer behavior. How does sustainability really factor into consumer behavior? I mean, are consumers more interested in electric vehicles? Are they shopping from environmentally conscious retailers?
These were actually 2-3 questions in one, right? I mean, first, what is kind of what we see, and that's globally, and that's again reflected also in our MENA study, is that consumers are more aware, conscious of price. So 4 out of 10 have actually held back larger, significant purchases also over the last 12 months. That's what consumers told us. At the same time, they are confident. So now when it comes to environmentalism and eco-consciousness, and there's obviously a wider field around environment, social governance from a consumer and also from a corporate brand perspective. But what we see here that's really interesting at global scale is that 2 out of basically every second consumer globally regards the aspect of environmentalism as a personal status symbol, so as a badge of honor. And that's also reflected again in the study that we ran in UAE, Saudi, and Egypt. And the awareness, consciousness for the environment is actually even higher in this market than the global average that we've seen in our consumer life study from GfK.
Really incredible findings there. Now, your survey also finds that 1 in 2 consumers are excited about the metaverse. How will the emerging metaverse really reshape retail and create new revenue streams in the MENA region?
Well, that's obviously a very wide question, and there's so much room for obviously for interpretation and for brands figuring this out. But obviously, this is going to be a topic for the next 5 to 10 years for consumers, for brands. Expert assessments are around $5 trillion that will be added in incremental value to the industry from the metaverse. So obviously we see that household leading consumer brands like Nike, Prada are stepping into the metaverse. But it's not only the Nike. For this region, Emirates Airline has just published their efforts around the metaverse to step into this. So this clearly is going to be the future, with all questions and eagerness to learn. What was interesting from our study to see that 2 out of basically every second consumer here in the MENA 3 region claimed that she or he has a good understanding of what the metaverse actually is. And even more so, 60% expressed a high interest to learn and to engage with the metaverse. So this I think to us in GfK is a high reflection also of the open-mindedness, of the tech affinity here in the region, especially in the UAE and Saudi market.
Really the future of consumerism there. And are consumers as interested in e-commerce now as they were during COVID lockdowns? Does e-commerce still have its huge appeal?
It definitely has. E-commerce is clearly here to stay. So we have seen in the MENA region for our kind of core industries in the tech and consumer goods industry, that's already at 22% of the revenue that's generated in the online segment for the specific region, and it's definitely to stay and to grow. I think what is more important is that from a consumer perspective, clients expect the best of both worlds, and they don't really. When I say 2 worlds, the consumers don't really distinguish between those 2 worlds. They obviously, this is a massive information channel. Consumers like to engage online, but they equally like to engage in the offline world. After 2 years of COVID, especially in this region, which is a very close and personal culture, people like to engage and are seeking actually the shopping experience in the malls, in retail, and that's also going to stay. So our outlook is that it needs a strong symbiosis. So that's what we'll find in a strong blend of on and offline.
Really interesting findings from this study. GfK's Global Vice President, Dr. Christoph Pross, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks a lot.